Oh, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome. I'm Shweta Saxena, and I'm the Chief for Macroeconomic Policy and Analysis section in the Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development division at ESCAP. So this is supposed to be our concluding session, basically after a two-day workshop that people have been sitting through. And I don't have to say much about what exactly COVID has meant to us. We all know 140 million jobs have been lost. About 89 million people could have been pushed into extreme poverty. And of course, COVID has already highlighted also the increasing divide between the haves and the have-nots, as we witnessed in the ability of people to be able to work or school from home during this period. And the issue with this crisis has been that much of the damage done during this crisis will have a long lasting impact. For instance, output will not recover to pre-crisis trend levels, as we've always seen in all sorts of shocks. Okay, that's a very normal thing that to happen. But the lost hours in work and schooling will have a long lasting impact on productivity and potential output. Now, this looks very terrible, right? Like looking ahead, life looks very terrible. However, every crisis is also a good time to press the reset button. And this is that good time, especially when climate change has become the most pressing issue of our times. So yesterday, if you were there at the opening session where Kaveh had mentioned in his opening remarks, and I'm going to quote, Asia Pacific developing countries have responded in an unprecedented manner, deploying more than $2 trillion to support households and firms. But so far, only a fifth of the recovery spending has had positive green characteristics. The region has so far missed the opportunity provided by the crisis to align the COVID-19 recovery efforts with national climate mitigation and adaptation aspirations and SDG commitments. So hence there has been a lot of spending that's been done, but not much has been done on the green front, so to speak. So this leaves a lot of room for policymakers to reset the button in climate change. Yet we've missed one opportunity during the global financial crisis. If you remember, we had big, large stimulus packages that were offered by the G20 countries that helped pull the entire global economy out of that really bad recession or almost a Great Depression sort of a thing. But of course, those also included brown and black policies, business as usual. So in this regard, this is again a fresh opportunity, right, for us to kind of set things right. And since yesterday, we've been discussing lots of different aspects of what policies can be implemented, especially on the fiscal front, what can be green. So let's actually talk in this very last session. As I just was saying, this is a very important session, I think, and I'm glad that we are ending on this note because we all know exactly what to do. But the problem always comes to what are the political constraints that prevent all these things from happening, right? Because there are always trade-offs between policies and what politicians think that they need to do and what people think that they need to do. So in this session, we have three great speakers who would unpack for us how to design these green fiscal policies to make them politically more acceptable. So let me actually, we'll have three speakers. I'll call them out in the order. So our very first speaker is going to be Dr. Jan Steckel. He leads the working group Climate Protection and Development at the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change. He conducts research mainly on the role of developing countries in reducing, which is basically mitigating carbon emissions. Research focuses on very interesting aspects: distributional impact of climate change mitigation instruments, political economy, especially of coal-fired power generation, interaction of sustainable development goals and climate change mitigation, energy supply in developing and emerging countries, climate policy instruments in developing and emerging countries. He was an author of the IPCC Special Report on Renewable Energy in 2011, the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report 2014 of Working Group 3 Mitigation, and lead author on coal phase out in the UNEP Gap Report 2017. So we are in very good hands here to actually understand the political economy of green fiscal policy. So over to you, Jan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much also for having me, and I'm looking very much forward to this session. Let me just share my screen, which I did now. I hope you can all see my slides. So in the next 10 minutes, I will talk a little bit about the equity impacts of green fiscal reforms, focusing on carbon pricing in low and middle income countries. This is basically speaking to a lot of research that we have been doing at MCC in the last few years, actually. And I would like to make the point that managing the equity concerns is key for making green fiscal policies work. It is basically the conditio sine qua non, so it will not work without. So why? Because we can expect political resistance to rising energy systems. Immediate price increases can lead to large protests that have the power to stop a potential reform, and therefore we have to be aware what the short-term distributional incidences are. And this is nothing new, right? I mean, this is something that we have seen in the context of, for example, energy subsidy reforms all over the place. I just give a few examples here: Indonesia 2012, Ecuador 2019, Iran 2019, and just in Nigeria 2020, just the latest of a large series of partly violent protests. So those interest groups, I would put it, that lose from policy reforms can be expected to lobby or protest against it. That is well known. It can be energy users, workers, fossil fuel owners, industry-specific regions. In any case, understanding those distributional effects and understanding how to manage them is really key for their success. So interestingly, if we focus on low and middle income countries, in contrast to what we see in most OECD countries, those pricing reforms would likely be progressive. So this map basically shows you the income effect on the lowest group relative to the national average. This is from an analysis that we did comparing 87 countries. You can basically see the greener it gets, the more progressive a reform would be. You can see that with the exception of a few countries, we would expect progressive effect of carbon pricing. That is, the poorest groups are less affected than the richer ones. The key mechanism here is really that difference in energy expenditures drive the results, and we can confirm this also with other studies not shown here, for example, meta-analysis of the existing literature. However, first of all, the design matters. This graph, don't be shocked by its complexity. It is basically showing you the distributional effects of various carbon pricing designs, including an international carbon price in red, a national carbon price in blue, priced only in the power sector, such in a way that China implemented it, or a price only on liquid fuels. And basically all these graphs are normalized to the poorest income groups, to the effect on the poorest 20%. So whether the effects are above or below 1 shows you whether this effect would be progressive or regressive, because then in the following we see the effects on the following expenditure quintiles. So what you can see is that it really matters in which country you apply which design, and indeed there are particular designs that can also lead to regressive results. For example, if you thought of taxing only liquid fuels in Bangladesh as compared to a national price. However, we can generally assume that those effects would be progressive, the distributional effects still might hurt the poor, right? Even distributional implications can mean a substantial burden to incomes of the poor households, which you see in this map. It's basically from the same study that I have shown before, the same 87 countries, and you can see the income effect of the lowest group, just assuming a US $30 carbon tax. And you can see that in some countries, it can be indeed very severe. So an effect of 3.5% of the income to cope with a green fiscal policy can, I think, be considered to be very severe. So there are two questions that I would shortly touch upon. That is, first, what does it then mean for development indicators, right? What does it mean for food? What does it mean for energy use? And the important aspect, particularly when we are interested in the acceptability question, is then how do we use the revenues to protect the most vulnerable groups? I think when we think of green fiscal policy reforms in LMICs, then it is extremely important to have the particularities of those countries in mind. And this is, for example, and due to time reasons, I only touch upon this, one example here. This is, for example, the high prevalence of charcoal and firewood for cooking, particularly for the poorest. And here, I think this is something that we need to consider, that a fossil fuel price hike driven by a green fiscal policy reform might actually raise biomass collection. What do I mean? This is just a very easy graph from Senegal following a fossil fuel subsidy reform in 2008. Basically, what we have seen is that the use of LPG has dropped dramatically by approximately 50%, whereas the use of charcoal and firewood has gone up. So this is something that we do not want, that we actually would like to reduce, but what has happened actually by this reform. So there might actually, and this would then, of course, and you all know this, come with negative health impacts. It would adversely impact female labor supply and women's time use, and it potentially drives forest degradation. So when thinking of these reforms, I think this is something we need to have in mind. Then let me quickly talk about the general aspects of distributional effects and how to basically alleviate them. And I think there are, of course, and the nice thing with green fiscal policies is that it generates revenues. However, we really need to take the institutional realities into account when we think of revenue recycling scheme. One aspect, and I start with the one that is maybe the least obvious, might be to take the revenues and put them into infrastructure investments to foster other SDGs. For example, access to electricity, access to sanitation, access to water. This is something that you can see here on the right-hand side, where you in red see the uncompensated effects on various income groups, again in red, and in green would be the effect of a compensation. First, a lump sum transfer, so just everybody gets the same amount, and then investment in access to water, sanitation, electricity. You can see that this would be highly progressive and highly beneficial for the poor. However, we have a problem here, namely a time delay, right? Until these effects come into effect and until people see this, the benefits, it will take time, and this, of course, has an issue for acceptability. It might be easier to keep transaction costs low, to really use what is there. So use the existing schemes versus creating new instruments for compensation. This is something that we exemplarily calculated for Ecuador in light of the fossil fuel subsidy reform in 2019. Again, in red, you see the uncompensated effects, and just showing you the results for diesel here. Again, in Ecuador, this would actually be regressive, but with compensation, it can be made really progressive, and you can also see that you can make the poorest groups really better off. So they are not only compensated, but they are overcompensated for the losses. And then there are various options, including scaling up the existing scheme, expanding the eligibility of the existing scheme, or establishing a new channel. And depending on what we calculated, you can see that up to 80% of the population could actually be overcompensated for the effects of this particular reform. However, and this is my last point, I would like to make a very strong point that we need to basically also consider the very heterogeneous effects in a society. This is from an analysis that we did for Indonesia. Again, you see the uncompensated effects of a $5 car price. Why $5? Because this is what Indonesia is currently discussing for now 10 income groups. So the poorest 10% on the bottom, the richest 10% at the top. And you can see that if we looked only at the average, which is the dot, the white dot here, we miss actually the white effects within these income groups. So if we now look into potential revenue recycling schemes, for example, universal transfers, you can see that if we had a lump sum transfer in place, then we really would overcompensate the poorest 30%. So here, nobody, really virtually nobody, could expect actually a negative effect from this reform. However, if we use an existing transfer scheme, for example, the social registry, the UDB in Indonesia, here you see that the effects are much more widespread simply because the full coverage of these schemes is not necessarily secured. And I think this is a really important point that we need to discuss and also to think of how to really make sure that if we think of revenue recycling, that you can indeed make sure that the poorest are not affected, that can make sure that those that you want to protect are protected. But if we have those in place, then we really need to make sure that we basically get it right and that it is really beneficial for the majority, that the schemes are working, that the coverage is secured, etc. So let me conclude with my 4 key points. So the distributional effects of green fiscal policy reforms are likely progressive. Progressivity, however, hides huge differences within income groups. We need to think how to recycle the revenues, and this is really non-trivial. And we need to make those policies socially and politically acceptable, but this requires to embed them in broader social policy considerations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jan. Actually, you made all the points very succinctly, actually, about how all these fuel subsidies and all these kind of things are very regressive to begin with, and how to actually make these things, make the transition a little bit more just, actually, by targeting them. So thank you. It was wonderful. So now, actually, we go to our next speaker, Mr. Dudi Ruliadi, Senior Policy Analyst in Fiscal Policy Agency, Ministry of Finance of Republic of Indonesia. Over to you, Mr. Dudi.
Thank you, Sweta, and thank you for inviting us to this time event. Very nice to see Jan here as well. We've been discussing the carbon tax implementation in Indonesia for quite some time with him, and still continuing. So as requested, we are going to present the role of the Coalition of Finance Minister for Climate Action in fostering fiscal policies for a green recovery. As you are aware, Indonesia is currently the co-chair of the coalition, and I will cover 4 topics here. First, designing economic policies in the aftermath of the COVID-19. Secondly, macro fiscal context and supportive policies. Thirdly, the coalition continues its work in green recovery, and lastly, implementation plan on carbon pricing case of Indonesia, which I will very briefly touch upon. First is I would like to introduce the coalition as a context. In the next slide, it is new and experimental and in evolution in a development phase initiative, but it provides a forum for finance ministers to engage in discussions to learn from each other's experiences and in fiscal policy making. Of course, what works and what doesn't, including green recovery policy. It initiated firstly in annual meetings, World Bank IMF 2018 in Bali, but actually it began before that. Climate Action Peer Exchange, founded by the World Bank and the Morocco COP22 presidency before that. So now we have 62 members as of July 2021. With 18 institutional partners, and we hope it's increasing. In terms of the history, the coalition was established formally in April 2019, and in October 2019, in the second ministerial meeting, the member have increased into 50 countries. And then at the third meeting in December 2019, we launched Santiago Action, and which outlines strategy implementing Helsinki principles. And lastly, in October 2020, at the fourth ministerial meeting, we established the governance charter and the work priorities related to climate action in the pandemic. So the coalition objectives, as you know, it's a forum for exchanging experience and policy between among members, sharing good practices, developing knowledge, workshop domestic policy, learning from constituencies, convening global experts, and supporting finance minister. We have 6 Helsinki principles, as you know. Align policies, practice, share experience, work toward measures, check climate change, mobilize private sources of climate finance, and lastly, engage actively in domestic preparation and implementation of NDC. Next slide. In terms of designing economic policies in the aftermath of COVID-19, we coalition initiated a work to analyze the implication of COVID-19 crisis. And we highlight that 3 key frameworks are necessary for green recovery. And this is the coalition first report, Better Recovery, Better World, with the assistance of Grantham Research Institute. Firstly, strong investment. Secondly, micro fiscal context, and lastly, financial system. For strong investment, we highlight that designing strong investment strategies, programs, and projects are important. Fast, labor intensive in the short run, high multipliers, co-benefits, including for climate and resilience. In terms of micro fiscal context, it's about carbon prices, regulations, and bailout conditionalities. And lastly, on financial system, ensure finance is available and aligned with sustainability. Next slide. This is the macro fiscal context and supportive policies. We mentioned 3 policies here: carbon pricing in the next slide. Secondly, the regulations and standards, and bailout conditionalities. This is the macro fiscal context. Fiscal expansion is necessary, but you know it's challenging for many countries. But fiscal multipliers from green projects can outperform those from alternative investment. In the need of fiscal expansion, fiscal multiplier effects of green projects, concerns on that is important. On the next slides, I will now proceed to the role of the coalition to foster fiscal policies in green recovery. As I highlighted in the very beginning, in October 2020, the coalition highlighted the importance of green recovery. And after that, early in the 2021, we designed a work program on green recovery. And in April 2021, in the 5th ministerial meeting, it provides further guidance from ministers' members. And we'll soon be designing the 2nd report on green recovery. Next slides. This is the role of coalition for fostering fiscal policy in green recovery. We highlight 3 Helsinki principles. The first one is green recovery report, fiscal balance in a carbon neutral society, completed in October 2021. Under Helsinki Principles 2, institutional partner activities on training and capacity building. And under Helsinki Principle 3, 4 work streams have been established. First, carbon taxation, fossil fuel subsidies, ETS, and carbon border adjustment. And other work, joint workshop with NGFS last November in the area of climate risk management and coordinated actions between finance ministers and central banks. Next slide. We do a green recovery survey with the results that first, advanced economies have more capacity to provide fiscal stimulus and carry out recovery plans than emerging economies. Secondly, the priority sector in implementing green recovery is circular economy and digitalization. Thirdly, most investment constraint is insufficient project pipeline and preparation. And fourthly, political economy and insufficient technical capacity are factors holding back to implement green recovery. And lastly, the finding of the survey is access to green sustainable finance is the most important constraint on financing green recovery plan. Next slides. We also include in the report the result of the Oxford Tracker March 2021. On the left-hand side, we can see that a total rescue and recovery in emerging market and developing economies is 10% of the GDP, whereas in advanced economies, total rescue and recovery amount to 22% of the GDP. So it's quite a stark contrast. On the right-hand slide, the total green recovery spent by 8 countries is 341 billion, which is 17 of the total recovery spent globally. Next slide. We can see that the on the left-hand slide, rescue and recovery spending, we can see a difference between the advanced and emerging developing economies. We see that almost 20% of GDP spent by advanced economies, whereas only less than 6% from the emerging developing economies. And advanced countries utilizes almost 17% of GDP for rescue recovery plan compared to only 7% of GDP from emerging market developing economies. Next slide, the initial result of the survey identifying project pipeline, as I said, remains of the top constraint for investment pre-COVID and during COVID-19, and countries' political economy situation remains as top policy constraint for green fiscal policy. Next slide. This is also the initial result of the survey. Budget revenue remains as the top financial sources for recovery plans. Identifying project pipeline and aligning project financing to sustainability standards are still the most important constraint on financing green recovery plans. Next slide on green fiscal policies. In the left-hand slide, this is the political economy challenges of green fiscal policies. Differences in the challenges faced by both developed and developing countries. For developed countries, they are facing challenges in distributional impact, and whereas developing countries facing challenges in maintaining adaptation and mitigation reduction, coupled with economic growth and poverty reduction. In the report, we also note that to ensure socially inclusive green fiscal policy and mitigate short-term effects of green fiscal policy, there are 6 items. Firstly, engage international support, prioritizing best-in-class projects. Thirdly, focus on labor-intensive short-term projects. Channel financing activities with local government and civil society. Fifth, ensure stimulus package takes a holistic perspective, meaning we need to work with other line ministries, not only a single ministry executing a program. And lastly, promote environmental taxes, regulations, and bailout conditions to incentivize green economy. And lastly, another recommendation is on green budgeting policies. Green budgeting policies are important to measure the success of green policy, green fiscal policy in both short-term and long-term. The application of green budgeting across countries are various. Some aspects of green budgeting are quite sophisticated, otherwise tagging revenues, expenses, or otherwise, and are not yet to be adopted across countries. The coalition stresses the importance to adopt green budgeting policies to guide future decisions, to assess different proposals and design a fiscal recovery package that has a material impact on the government ability to meet its economic objectives as well as environmental and climate goals, and to inform revenue use of carbon tax. And lastly, the successful use of carbon revenue use to lower income and corporate tax in British Columbia in Canada could be one of the successful examples of job creation on the short term. And I think I will skip the last Indonesia slide on Indonesia on carbon trading and carbon tax implementation. This is just the update on the latest policy in Indonesia to lay the foundation for the green economy in the aftermath of COVID-19 on carbon trading and carbon tax, which currently are being discussed in the government. Sorry for the extra time, 3 minutes time extra, and I give the floor back to Sweta. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nudi. It was a very nice presentation. As you were doing it, I was thinking about the coalition themes of the Coalition of Finance Ministers, just like NGFS is. And apparently, I think the two work, right? You work with the NGFS as well, which is basically for the central banks. It's the same platform. Very nice. Thank you. Let's actually have the last presentation, and then we can move on to our Q&A session. So our last but not the least speaker is Mr. Asad Naqvi. He leads the research and advisory services work of UNEP's Green Economy team on agriculture and food, poverty reduction and inclusiveness, and trade in biodiversity-based products. He has more than 18 years of experience of providing technical assistance and policy advice through global, regional, and national programs in areas of green economy and development planning, economic policy, governance reforms, trade policy and negotiation, poverty reduction, and food security. Currently, he leads a team which supports countries and regions in achieving the sustainable development and poverty reduction goals through greening of economies. Asad holds a Master's of Arts degree in Environment, Development and Policy from University of Sussex in the United Kingdom, and a Master's of Science degree in International Relations from Quaid-e-Azam University in Pakistan. Over to you, Asad, for some wonderful insights on this topic.
Thank you, Sweta, and that was a very generous introduction. I'm humbled. Thank you so much. And I would say it's very hard to add more to what John and Mr. Rudiadi has already mentioned. I think that's where it's coming from. Currently, I'm heading a team at the Secretariat of the Partnership for Action on Green Economy, and it's called PAGE. And this is a coalition of 5 UN agencies. And I think some of the issues that we are discussing were the drivers of creating PAGE, that it's not only the making the economic and business case, which is important for transition or transformation to a more green and inclusive economy. I think there is a lot more that needs to happen, and political economy side is just one dimension of that. So now we are 5 UN agencies working together. So UNEP is one part, ILO, the labor organization of UN, is another part. UNDP, the development and development planning, is another part. UNIDO is very important in this coalition for industry and SMEs, and UNITAR, which offers research and capacity building support. So I don't have a few slides, but I have a few thoughts to share with you. And I think I will go with the questions that you put for us as speakers. So how policymakers can ensure that the green fiscal policies are more and recovery packages are more inclusive? And my feeling is that we are now supporting about 20 countries, and many of them are working on fiscal reforms. So our learning is that actually policymakers do think a lot of making sure that the fiscal reforms and green fiscal reforms are socially inclusive and transition is very just. And that is one of the reasons that actually these reforms are not moving forward. I'm not saying that their comprehensions are unjust. I think they are very grounded realities that sometimes when we provide advice to policymakers are not able to take into consideration fully. Now, if you look at the fiscal space in many developing countries, and I will come to the developed country challenges as well, there is a reality that sometimes is not very visible to the outsider experts. There are very hard choices that policymakers have and decision makers, especially on fiscal size, have to make almost every day, but at least in budget decisions. And in the absence of having a very strong social protection policy in place, these hard choices become the issue of livelihoods, losing and gaining jobs. And if I can put it in a very simple terms, it's a decision between today, investing in today, or keeping it for tomorrow. And I think that's a very valid concern that many policymakers have when they're thinking about fiscal policy reforms, and especially on environmental fiscal reforms. So that was my first point, that there are hard realities and hard choices to be made. Some of these choices are based on consideration of decision makers about the social dimensions of, as we call it, green economy, that, okay, we need to be stronger on that. So we need to justify that. We need to take more that into the considerations. Then the second point is that, what we are doing now as advisor to the policymakers is that we are making a very strong, a very valid, and a very convincing economic and business case for environmental fiscal reforms. There is no doubt about it. We are pushing rightly for doing the right thing now, because we know that in the future, the cost of no action will lead to more damages. Okay. We also know that, the economic gains from the brown economy will eventually trickle down, and it will create more cost for the society, for the planet, and everyone. So that case is very solid. Then is the third question, which Savita, you were asking, the why it's not happening. If we have a strong case, if we have a valid case, in economics and science, in my view, are very clear that we need to move in the direction of green environmental fiscal reforms. Now, there are a few points that I would make, and we have learned based on experiences in these 20 countries. Number first, I think it's very easy to introduce fiscal incentives at any point of time. It's very difficult to take them out, and that's why they have to be thought out very carefully. And that's where, despite that I support and I lead a program which is pushing that the green economy is the right way forward, I'm very careful when I'm advising a country that you should put fiscal incentives in place to promote renewable energy, let's put it that way. Because, once they are in there, they create a dependency syndrome, and then everyone becomes dependent. And when you want to take them out, there is another hard reality, especially in developing countries, that those vested interests who are powerful, they are well represented in policy decisions. So it's very hard. Anything that damages their interest, you will not be able to take it out very easily. Yeah, so you will have to really wrangle it out. And they are very organized. But then there are the poor and the poorest of the poor, or the women and marginalized, who have hardly any representation in the policy process. So then it's people, it's the analytics, like what John was doing, that, okay, how the poor is impacted and how we make it progressive. But so far, the vested interest voices are far more louder and influential. and the civil society voices in decision making do not have the same level of representation. I'm not saying that they are not there, but they don't have the same level of representation. And that makes a huge difference. So that was the second point that we need to make, that, okay, so how do we bring in those, asymmetrical power dimension in the debate on policy decisions? Now, that was the second thing, that the dependency syndrome that comes in. And then the third point that I want to possibly make is that there is a problem of commons. Yeah, so these subsidies and these incentives become common for everyone. And when they become common for everyone, then the fight starts that who gets the bigger share of it. And that's a reality. And then it's the one who has the power, he will make most out of it. Now, there is a new dimension coming into political economy of environmental fiscal reforms or green economy, which is the role of the corporate sector. And I'm talking about the big global corporate sectors. I'm talking about the Amazons and Googles and all those people. They are becoming a big voice in environmental and economic decision making, and especially in economic and investment decision makings now. So, how do we create an enabling environment in which the voices of the poorest of the poor and Googles of the world are both heard? And that's another important dimension to look at when we are providing advice for environmental fiscal reforms. The other, similarly connected to this asymmetric power reality in the world, is that now, when we are looking at financing, and we just heard an excellent presentation on the finance ministers for climate change, that more and more I hear a voice that, okay, the financing for climate change cannot be done only through public sector, so it has to come from private sector. And that is a reality. It's just a truth. But how does it come and what conditionalities it will bring, that will determine if the private sector is investing for maximizing profit, or is it investing to achieve SDGs and help us address the climate change. Again, the regulatory power of many states is very limited when it comes to big financing. So we need to invest in that. That should be part of our support for environmental fiscal reforms, that we are able to improve the regulatory capacity of the state. And number two, we need to make sure that, it's not the climate running behind the money, but the money coming behind the climate or sustainability movement. Now, the last point that I want to make, and there are a few more that I can come to if there are questions and answers, but the last point I want to make is that how does it happen in developed countries and developing countries? And that's a big difference. I live in Switzerland. There was a vote on green economy. So anything that you want to change, they go to referendum, and Switzerland loves referendum. So they went to a vote on green economy. And, there was a debate, political debate, and vote was turned down, and the government accepted, okay, we have to have another plan. Then the government has enhanced NDCs, made a commitment to Paris, and then, the climate neutrality debate. 2 months ago, there was another vote, and it's turned down. Now, these are the countries I'm talking about, which has the financial resources to implement strong measures. They have access to technology, finance, capacity, human resources, everything that is needed. But the government is accepting the will of the people, and the people are not ready to take those hard decisions. You have seen what happened in France, the Yellow Vest movement. The same thing, minor increase in fossil fuels, and the people are on the road. Yesterday, you may saw in Spain what is happening. Now it's the energy companies which are the target because the prices have gone up. Now we talk about transition, we talk about environmental fiscal reform, but the transition has to be looked at very carefully. Is it the same person who is losing a job in a coal mine who will get a job in solar panel installation? No. If it's not the same person, what do? We say we will develop his skills. But the person who is losing a job, is he thinking about developing his skills, or is he thinking about going to protest in the streets? I think it's the second. And those are the political economy dimensions, which are very soft, which we need to take more into consideration. Now, my last point, where is the hope and where is the thing of the future? I was very inspired when I saw the survey that came out yesterday from the Bath University about youth perceptions about climate change. And you may have seen this. 40% of them are scared of the future. 50% or more think that humanity is doomed in future. Now, that's where I think the political economy has to build its foundations on. There is an increasing number of population which is feeling the pain, but we have not been able to link it with the policy reforms and especially with the environmental fiscal reforms. The challenge, as I was saying, is that these people, it's a survey in 10 countries just released yesterday, but how many of these young people have a say in environmental and fiscal policy reforms when it comes to decision making? Probably no. So we have to create that space. Number two, I feel that there is a shift in mentality of the regimes around the world that we need to move forward and we need to do something right. And this, finance ministers talking about climate change is a source of hope and inspiration. I think we need to provide the right information to that and channel it into. Number three, number three is probably this job agenda, which I think is a driver. We have not been able to make a very strong case to the public that addressing climate change is the biggest job creation opportunity that we have in front of us. The business as usual economies are becoming, they call it more productive, labor productivity increasing, but the other side of it is that people are losing jobs because just of the robotization of the economy, etc. And climate is the opportunity. So we need to take that message very strongly to the world, that how it will create jobs and livelihoods, etc., and reduce inequality. So that is the third. And then, I can possibly stop here, but just the last point, that what we did, a few examples. In Peru, we are supporting Peru in greening of economy. And we did a macroeconomic analysis, which looked at, okay, if you invest certain amount of money in certain sectors and have the enabling policy reforms in place, what will happen to jobs, growth, prosperity? It was the University of Pacifico and the UN resident coordinator in the country who decided that, okay, we will have, before the elections, we will have a presidential candidates debate on the findings of this report. And that brought the thing into the political discussion. In Senegal, we are working with parliamentarians on how the green economy will look like if we have to make investments into it. And they are able to create committees on, let's say, green economy or green environmental reforms, which then is taking the parliament. Now, the challenge in some countries is that we work with the government, but there is a huge opposition which is in the parliament. So if government gets something done right, they feel that they will lose another election. The opposition feels that they will lose another election. So it has to go beyond, government. It has to be like society as a whole and politics as a whole type thing. And the last one I will mention is Argentina, where we are working with the climate cabinet on just transition, just to make sure, because Argentina's economic problems, that they need to make sure that it's a transition to green economy is just and job rich. And that's what is, and last point I want to make is that environmental fiscal reforms are not a short-time thing, but short-time process. You have to take the whole society with you. Otherwise, you will have the Gilets jaunes in France and rejection of the referendums in Switzerland. The poor people in probably developing countries can't do the same, and probably the government don't listen to the same way. It doesn't mean that they don't feel the pain. And I'll stop here and I will wait for the questions, Rita. Thank you.
Thank you, Safar. Really very interesting. You have packed so many things in there, and I could actually start off right off the bat. But one thing that you actually mentioned, I really was more fascinated about. By the way, I've lived in Switzerland too, and this is one of those countries that lives by the credo of democracy. Like everything goes to vote, actually, to the masses. So I know how it works. But apparently about the financing, I just wanted to actually point out one thing you were talking about, the financing, where it has to come from the private sector now. Does it have to be actually about the return or the impact? And it's quite interesting. I hope people will ask some questions on this. Otherwise, I'll come back to it, because I just was in a private discussion, a roundtable discussion with Financial Times, actually on this exact basically thing with all these guys who are basically ESG investors and So I'll bring it. Anyways, thank you so much. You had too many things to actually, I can't even summarize. I was just putting them down on my, my notepad. Okay, we'll talk more about it. So let me see actually if we have questions from people in general. So why don't we start with the questions that we've already received? And then please kindly send your questions through the chat. And if you want to actually talk directly, I assume probably you can talk. You can raise your hand and I can bring you up actually. Okay, so there's the first question is for Jan. Jan, actually, how do transfer policies balance with government revenue? Are they revenue neutral? Do they need additional funding besides the carbon tax? That's a question somebody had asked. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think this is very much a decision that basically needs to be taken by the societies themselves, right? Like you basically can think of the entire spectrum. So I forgot to mention that if you remember my example from Ecuador, if you basically did it with the first option where you basically just increase the eligibility of the scheme. So basically just make those that are today eligible for the existing social security to also get transfers with regard to this fossil fuel subsidy reform, it would, I forgot the exact number, but it would have left a couple of hundred of millions of dollars for the government to spend however they want. And I think like these are discussions we need to basically have, right? What is the amount of revenues that shall be recycled? What is the amount of revenues that shall be invested, for example? And interestingly, this refers very much to country specifics and how actually people actually find those revenue recycling schemes acceptable. And this differs from country to country. In Germany, for example, it is frequently found that that people find it more acceptable if the revenues were invested into renewable energy and grid infrastructure rather than recycled back to the population for the majority. And here I think it is also important what we just heard, right? That like the effects are very heterogeneous and some people, some even minorities might actually have the power to stop the reform, and you might want to think how to compensate them, right? This in the end might lead to very tough decisions. Think, for example, like of the political economy constraint that, for example, in the coal sector that we just have heard, maybe we need some of the revenues to buy out the coal industry. This is something that we maybe don't like from an equity perspective, but it might be necessary to break the political economy. So the answer to your question is it depends. You can, of course, recycle the full amount of revenues, but how much you use in the end depends very much on the country context.
Thank you, Jan. There's another question actually here from Himanshu, and I think both of you can take it actually. Is there also a disconnect between the potential for environmental action to underpin a new economic growth paradigm that's more inclusive and sustainable than the current one, and the perception or misperception that the environment and the economy do not overlap and are mutually exclusive in planning and design circles? Mm-hmm. So is there room for a new paradigm? Jan, Asad, do you want to take it up?
Room for a new paradigm. Good question. Let me frame it a little bit differently. I definitely think there is room for a new narrative, because something that we haven't spoken about that much, particularly in the context of low and middle income countries, is that we are talking about countries that generally have issues in actually generate revenues, right? Independent of climate change, green fiscal policy reforms, etc. In my opinion, and I'd be like, I'm happy to be corrected here, but in my opinion, actually generating revenues and having like a green fiscal policies in place is a way to actually generate revenues in general in a quite secure way. It is much safer than actually taxing labor, taxing capital, what you usually do as a government, right? Because it is quite difficult to forego. We know more or less how much fossil fuels enter the economy, be it at the wells or at the borders. And we can tax it. We can tax the carbon content. Actually, also low income countries can do it, and they do it already if you think of fuel taxes. So it might actually be a way to increase the revenues, to increase the entire tax base, and then do whatever you want to do with it, right? Like reduce other taxes, as Seth mentioned, or recycle it back, or use it for investment, etc. I think this might actually be a new paradigm, not only basically to think of the environmental component here, but really putting this fiscal component, the ability to raise revenues, into the center of the debate. It is maybe more narrative than an entire paradigm, but maybe this is going in the direction of your question.
Thank you. Asad, you want to jump in actually?
Well,
this is sort of
yeah.
your...
Well, I think there is a first part of the question. Is there a disconnect? And I feel that the data analysis, forecasting, whether, whatever system dynamic models we have used, environment is now the new engine of growth in a way. Like, it's like a cleanup operation in a way, a cleanup operation for the whole planet in so many dimensions that we have polluted and destroyed it, that this is the opportunity for new investment, for new jobs and new economic growth. And again, I would say that it was the weakness, not on the making the business case and the economic case, it was the weakness on the communications, on the political economy side, that we have not seen the misallocation of capital being corrected even 10 years after we launched the Green Economy report, in which we made a very clear and convincing case that this is the way forward. So I think time is still there. You in the very beginning asked, is it the time to reset? My feeling is that it was yesterday, so we are late. And we should do it still now. Why not? And the resetting requires a paradigm shift, not in economics, but in thinking and mentality. Now, we are looking at the political economy side of it. One thing which, in my view, we should also look at, and probably more so increasingly, is the behavioral economics part of it. And that's where the consumer side will come in, that, what is driving the economy. So we are looking a lot at the production side. We are trying to fix the industry and the agriculture and fisheries and everything, which is the supply side. But we are not focused so much on the behavioral economics, that the demand can also drive the supplies. And that's, I think, more work is probably needed. If that paradigm shift in thinking happens, my feeling is that could trickle up, because the policymakers, the decision makers, the financiers are coming from the same society. And I'm very encouraged when I see at the number of my children go to, a school, and in the school now there is so much focus on behavioral change towards the environment. So hopefully next generation will be far more practicing than me, which is more of a preacher and less practices and have spent half of their life not even knowing what to do about the environment. And I think that's where the paradigm shift will come. The second thing is that, yes, paradigm shift has to happen, because what you said initially, Paige is one of the humble partners in this global recovery observatory done by Oxford. And you mentioned Kaveh saying that 20% almost has something to do with the green. But the bigger question is, what is the rest of 80%? And how can we expect to rescue the planet and make it greener when 80% is actually at least not green? And my feeling is that, a big part of it is rescuing those industries which have contributed to the problem. Number three, which makes the paradigm shift even more important, is that when we invest 20% in it and 80% is still business as usual, we expect that things will change. And that will destroy the hope, because there is someone who is investing 20%. So he expects that at least the outcome of 20% should be equivalent to the 20% of the results, but it's not. The 80% will take over those 20%. So if you have 80% money invested in something which is creating pollution, and 20% which is trying to resist it, who will overtake? And that's why it's important that we make this case for behavioral change and the paradigm shift in mentality and thinking, because otherwise whatever we are putting in the system will be burned out without having the proportionate results. It will have results, but it will not be proportionate. Thank you.
Thanks, Asad. Actually, you're preaching to the choir at least. I mean, like, as far as I'm concerned, because for the last 3 years I've been at ESCAP, and this is a narrative shift and a change in mindset that I've been trying to push. And what you just said is something we emphasized a lot in our report last year. So last year's report, we actually produced the Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific, which is ESCAP's flagship. So last year's report, 2020, was actually looking at, the one of the SDGs where Asia Pacific was regressing was sustainable, responsible consumption and production. So we took it up upon ourselves and we said, so how do we work towards it, right? So we actually had more like a stakeholder economy sort of a framework, like, governments have to do their part, they have to get rid of their fossil fuel subsidies, they have to institute carbon tax, they have to green the financial system, but businesses have to come in exactly through their ESG investments and try to actually incorporate the environmental damage that they do in their actual costing of their activities. But the third one was actually about the consumers as well. I mean, like, consumers of even just products, we have to actually rethink about our lifestyles, because everything contributes, right, basically towards that end goal. So, or everybody has to come together. And interestingly enough, actually, if you recall, it was in 2019. I've been writing about these things for a long time, but it was right before I had written that there should be a stakeholder economy and purpose of business should not be profit. It should be actually purpose, actually, And in August of 2019, if you recall, the Business Roundtable back in the United States, where all these CEOs came out that we need to actually not have a shareholder economy, but a stakeholder economy, if you recollect that part, right? And interestingly enough, it's been almost 2 years. And I think the progress has been quite mixed. So these CEOs came out and said, oh, let's actually talk about the stakeholder. We have to talk about ESG, environment, social is also very important. A lot has been talk than actually the walk. And that's where it becomes a problem, right? Actually, where does the rubber meet the road? I mean, like, where does it all become sort of operational, basically? So everybody's been talking about it, but at least there is a shift in mindset. At least there is some kind of a awakening, so to speak, about how we need to think about it. But again, I can actually throw it back to you, and I said, the problem actually, I've always had a problem with this whole green growth and inclusive growth, because it still somehow emphasizes the growth aspect of it. And that takes the primary sort of like, the concern. So people forget the word green and inclusive, growth becomes the primary objective, so to speak. Now, I know some countries need to grow to get out of their poverty. We all know that. The whole routine. You need economic growth. All countries need to grow. Is there room for degrowth? Is there room to think in a new way, actually, that do we really need to grow, basically? I mean, we've achieved whatever there was to achieve. I mean, like, why do we need to continue to grow? So any thoughts on that, basically? Because that's something that fascinates me the most.
I don't know, John, you want to take a first cut?
I can try. Even though I think it's your turn for a change. No, I take it. Room for degrowth. Like, I personally, I'm a little bit more skeptical about this. I'm personally, and this is of course my personal opinion, I'm still not fully disillusionated from the green growth paradigm, honestly, also because I barely see politically different opinions. So we basically have seen a glimpse also by the COVID pandemic what happens if also rich countries start contracting, right? I mean, because what you then imply is a huge distributional conflict. So also in Western societies, what is, of course, like Western societies are very rich, but if I just look out of the window in the center of Berlin, I see people who collect garbage. We are very heterogeneous societies. Yes, we have world-class social security and all looks good in the numbers, but that doesn't mean that we don't have our own issues. If we now start to degrow, we will need to start to redistribute. And this is something that is extremely, extremely, extremely complicated for governments to do. So, we have an election coming up. and we discuss about these issues. Do we need higher taxes? Do we need wealth taxes, etc.? But there is a huge outcry of large parts of the society, particularly more the middle classes, right? And I think, by the way, I fully agree with what I said before. Like, I focused on the poor, but I fully, and this was basically my main point, I fully acknowledge that we need to look into the broader spectrum. We need to look into the heterogeneous effects, and like, as soon as you will actually start these degrowth issues, and you will basically touch on the consumption patterns of the middle classes, my fear would be that they kind of lose the trust and confidence in the governments here that work more or less fine. And this, I think, would be catastrophic, because this is like all what we are discussing somehow requires this trust in governments to deal with these issues, to raise taxes, to recycle, etc. And this is something that I also wanted to say in response to what Assad said before with respect to the Yellow Vest in France, or the repeated rejection of more ambitious climate change laws or whatever in Switzerland. I think this is at the core of the issue. Like in France, basically, we see huge parts of the population now distrusting the elites that rule the country. Switzerland is traditionally a very, let's say, libertarian country. Like, people do not like actually being taxed. This is kind of more a cultural habitus. And when I start discussing these issues of kind of taxing and recycling with my students, then I can bet with you that somebody, for example, from Nigeria says, are you crazy? I mean, you want to basically give money to those people? And I think this is like when we now then start to talk about degrowth, even in Western societies, I think that these problems we're also seeing with regard to populism, with regard to kind of eroding social cohesion, etc. I think these problems will rather become more severe than even. So if you would need to convince me that you have a really good solution to those problems if we start talking about a broader degrowth concept. I think it is more important to think of what shall grow, right, and what we actually would like to consume, how to distribute wealth, etc. Like, let's talk about this, and let's talk about how to incentivize this. And I think, coming back to the initial topic, I think here really we will need to talk about green fiscal policy reforms. I'm quite convinced about this.
Thank you, John. You made my, once again, you made my life easier. So I already see that the pressure is coming in. Yes. So Hamza is saying no. Hima is saying no. There is no space for degrowth. And
I knew Hamza would say that, actually, so I'm not surprised.
I know him well. But that's where I think we are coming in. And I think this could be an interesting debate. And probably if the mics could be switched on, it will be good to have views from Hamza and Hima and others, to have a real life debate on this. And this is how we probably sharpen our ideas, and that helps us to provide better advice to the governments and partners. So where does the limits to the growth started coming in? It's not a new thing. In 70s, there was this Silence of the Springs and all those books which were written. So what we are talking about here are two things. Number one, there are planetary boundaries. So the Earth, the planet Earth, cannot generate resources which are the foundations or the main inputs for the economic growth and activity. Unlimited. Yeah, so there are limits. Some people say that even now with the current economy, we are consuming almost 1.5 times of the resources that Earth can generate. So it's 1.5 times of the Earth. And by the end of the century, it will be 3 Earths, which will be needed if the trends remains the same. So these are, in my view, these are the real boundaries. So if we don't adjust ourselves to the supply side of the planet Earth will adjust us anyway. It will find its own ways. There are multiple pathways to achieving that. Okay, we can have more efficient growth in terms of the natural resource inputs, and the resource efficiency, material efficiency debate is moving in that direction. With the current pace, will we get to the point by the end of this century? Probably no. But is technological innovation possible? Yes. So it's possible that we have enough technology that can reduce the material inputs into the economy and we still have growth. Number two, there is a whole world, which I think John was referring to, which has overdrawn from its natural capital account on per capita basis or on country basis. Yeah. So this is the ecological footprint of our lifestyles. And here I'm talking about, those who are consuming many times more than their natural resource, natural capital account. And we have to look into that. And that's a real debate that needs to happen. But yes, how do you adjust your lifestyle? So when we say sustainable consumption, and I'm coming back to Savita, your point, which we are talking about Asia as well now, but in Europe, there's a big debate whether the sustainable consumption will lead to contraction of economy or not. Number two, when we are talking about circularity in economy, and EU has a very, very aggressive plan on building circularity in economy, what is its impact on aggregate demand? And what is its impact of that aggregate demand on the material flows between the country, which forms the foundation for trade? And many of the developing countries are exporters of only natural resources. So if there is a higher circularity at the other end, how the impact will happen? I think it is definitely going to be good for the environment, for sure, because your extraction and mining will go down and your circularity is high. So that is the other part of the growth paradigm discussion that we need to look at. And then the third thing is that yes, growth is needed, absolutely needed for certain people to bring to a certain level of human development index. Yes, so you cannot have one formula which works for all. We will need to have different formulas. And the growth is needed not only growth is needed in material consumption of those people who have been left behind in the development process. And that's where I like recently the concept of donut economics that you may have seen. There are certain people who needs to be pulled out of poverty and brought to a certain level of human development. And that requires, economic decision-making and fiscal reforms and everything so that they have a decent quality of life. There are people who have overdrawn from their natural capital account and they somehow have to come within the boundaries. And that will require a major restructuring of the economy. And that's where I come back to Hima's point that that's a transformational shift that is needed, not only in thinking, but in policy and practice and implementation at all levels. And I will invite Hamza to come in if he can now.
Actually, Hamza, you're more than welcome to actually join in right now. But just one point I wanted, that's why I started off. I didn't say that everybody has to degrow. I mean, I did not mean that. I was saying, yes, some countries need to grow, but do all countries need to grow is the question. And actually, the math just doesn't add up. I mean, if you want to continue your own consumption patterns within the planetary boundaries, the math is very clear. It's not going to add up, right? So something's got to give in. So what has to give in? Actually, you figure it out, right? That's one thing. But the other thing actually is everybody who seems very gung-ho on technology, I have a very big issue with that because you know what? Yes, we can actually have technological advancement that would make everything very efficient, right? So we're going to be very efficient at using resources. But then you know what? Our demands are going to go up 10 times. If we are 10 times more resource efficient, then our demands are going to go up 10 times. Nothing is ever going to change. I mean, so it brings us back to the same thing that it's a mindset of what our lifestyle should be and what is it that I'm willing to live with to actually have, more sustainable sort of outlook. So Hamza, you're more than welcome to come in now. I knew what you wrote actually.
If I can make one more point on your last point before Hamza comes in, because I want to give him the hard job to find a solution. There is a fascinating work that is happening with the faith-based organizations. And I think we are not looking at that neither in behavioral change, neither in political economy.
I do.
Yeah, okay. I'm talking about myself, yeah. And our, but that is where I think I find this end product of life is satisfaction, happiness, tranquility. In most cases, we have linked it with material ownership. That's where we draw it from. And that is what is leading this, race to the everything rather than race to the bottom. But if you look at that concept of human satisfaction is very powerful if we are able to understand it and be able to make it a foundation of this planetary boundary crisis solution. But then it comes from different faiths, and we have people, all type of people, faith-based and non-faith-based, and everyone. And that's a liberal choices. But I just felt that that was a very strong narrative that I heard from faith-based organizations.
Actually, that's the kind of a little bit of the narrative I push in my blogs that I write, actually. But go ahead. I saw Hamza, more than welcome, actually. Yes.
Hi, colleagues. This is Hamza. This is Asad brought me directly in the conversation. I was very keenly listening and taking my notes. Shweta and I have been debating these issues for 3-4 years. I had a long couple of chats with Asad already as well, a few months back. For me, it's a little more simpler in some sense. Degrowth in these issues is a non-starter. It's like trying to live in the world of black or white. It doesn't work in practice like that. There are all sorts of shades of gray. So you don't have to go from all growth to degrowth. That's why I'm trying to put in the comments, basically about the quality of the growth. How do you respect planetary boundaries you're talking about? Understanding what are the limits. But I was going to say something that Asad actually said at the last observation. I'll put it differently, not faith-based per se. That's one aspect. To me, it's more about understanding and revisiting the values we want to place up there as societal objectives, and then draw what we want to do. We have been conditioned, and we mean economists in general, have been conditioned for a few generations now that the ultimate purpose of economic life is maximization of material output, which translates into GDP and everything. So to me, this is this relentless and continuous and singular focus on GDP is the problem. GDP growth is a problem. Not GDP growth per se at all. So it's not about what growth can do for people. No, it's like what kind of activities you value in a society. Then you see whether they contribute in a conventional set of growth, or the metric to be decided, what you call growth, GDP growth, needs to be revisited also. All this new work that is going on in the statistics world, to me, it's extremely promising. They are 20 years ahead of economists. I've said it many times at different forums. The CEA, the systematic environmental accounts, basically, it's a fascinating. If anybody had a chance to read their manuals, they are beautiful. I mean, they are systematic, they're organized, they're interrelated. It's just they don't have the data, but they are laying out to me, as I understand and read it, very clear theory, very, very clear theory. What has to be the case. This is on my desk right now because I'm reading this thing these days. I highly recommend that. Mark Carney's book, Values, the big thick. It's been already a month and a half, and I'm a little over half of the book.
Hamza,
First part, the whole idea of welfare values. Is that better now?
It's better, yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes the internet issues problem. So anyways, I won't go into too much detail. I'm just going to make just wanted to make this point of not getting carried away with this. Yes, we understand that too much emphasis on growth has created problems. So let's think about degrowth now. This is not what I will recommend. In coming back to the main conversation of this workshop, and I was going to say that in my concluding remarks anyways, in a minute maybe.
But the point is simple.
Well, I'll come back to that in a minute, but I just, Asad asked me to sort of intervene at this point. So I just wanted to make this a point here. It's just how do you frame your policies? For here, how you frame fiscal policies. Fiscal policies traditionally has not been very active in this domain. If anything, fiscal policy was mostly we talked about distributional issues, taxes and spending and those kind of things. Environment or climate action is new. Somebody said that actually, I was listening. Finance ministers talking about climate change. Well, that's new. We've been around for a while, listening to finance ministers all our lives. I don't recall finance ministers making strong commitments or interest in these issues. For the long time, it was something being to be handled somebody else, environment ministry or whoever. Finance ministers are all about finances, budget, macro issues, GDP growth, things like that. So the narrative is changing from a relentless pursuit of growth towards some sort of different model. Now, whether it results in degrowth, it results in a better quality of growth, it results in a new measurement of what should we value, that remains to be seen. But to say, to impose something, we should go toward degrowth, that's what I'm not going to propose. So I just wanted to say that, but I'll wait for the final remarks, maybe touch upon this issue again, but I'll talk about the workshop itself.
Actually, I'll just
Thanks,
get to...
Asad. Good to see you, Asad.
Thanks, Hamza. Actually, no, you'll be coming in another 10 minutes anyway. So just to actually wrap this issue up, actually, it isn't about degrowth. And the point is, yes, we know that there are other aspects, but the moment the word economic growth comes in, we only have one measure of growth, actually. That's economic growth that's been traditionally measured. We don't have these newer measures. They're going to take another 20 years to come, actually, where it will be available for countries. So for the next 20 years, we'll keep talking about economic growth, right? Yes, quality of growth, we all understand that, but the numerical numbers that everybody likes are not available on those. So it's very hard to change the narrative without those numbers. So you have to change the mindset in another way. That's my take on everything like that. Coming back to the question, actually, Christian had posed a question. I understand the argumentation of Jan, but the idea of decoupling economic growth and use of resources does not seem to be possible. What would your opinion be on this issue? Jan. And there's another question on...
that decoupling would not be possible. That's a question. Well, my understanding of this is that there is some decoupling that is for sure not possible. On the other hand, I would also like to highlight that we are currently living in times where we see a tremendous push in technological advancements, also with regards to materials, right? Like people are now making steel with hydrogen, etc. Like just to give you an example. So I would be very careful in saying that basically we need to think of the transition of our economies towards low carbon and more sustainable transitions using the materials that we know today. That, for example, like, I don't know, like you think of a wind turbine, that it needs like the same materials that we use for it today, like using the same material and energy input. Rather, I think we are currently seeing a transition from basically production or like material inputs being replaced increasingly by energy. Then the question is whether energy is scarce. And in my opinion, it is not. So basically, we do have like this tremendous source of renewable energy with regard to the sun, with regard to wind and other renewables. The question is whether we can harness them. And I would actually be more optimistic that we actually live in a world where we eventually wake up saying, well, energy is not a constraint. And then I'm not so sure whether decoupling is impossible or not. However, like let me maybe just make one final remark, maybe also to the debate and degrowth and growth. I actually agree that we probably need to end up like with a paradigm that is somewhere between, that is combining basically, because there is truth in both argumentations, right? We, for example, have propose that we need to think more into a perspective of sustainability transitions. And here it is then really interesting, what are the differences between these concepts? And I would actually argue there are four major differences. One is like, how is the conception of human well-being thought of, right? Like in the growth paradigm, we think of consumption. In degrowth, we think of a wide range of well-being indicators. In a sustainable transition perspective, we could think of a needs-based, human needs-based perspective. Then we basically have a dimension of the feasibility and desirability of economic growth. Here, I would say I'm rather agnostic, right? Like it's an empirical issue. We need to reduce, however, the growth dependence that basically the human needs are so much dependent on, fulfilling human needs are so dependent on economic growth. Then we can think of policies. Where are then the preferred intervention points? And I think in the classical growth perspective, we think of technological options. Degrowth people, I would argue, emphasize more structural interventions, changing social norms and behavior. We have discussed about this earlier. I would say we need basically a combination of both, right? We need to think of technological options as well as measures how we address social norms and power relations that make those technological options also acceptable. And fourth, we can think of policy preferences, right? And in the growth perspective, you would probably just say, okay, we need market-based policies, we have the central states as a central actor, etc. And here I would also be quite skeptic Also given that in many countries there is very little trust in these actors for good reasons, actually. In the degrowth perspective, by contrast, that basically all policies that affect the demand or supply side shall somehow include a broader social political system change, individual action, etc. I am not believing that like we will see the transition that we need by individual action. Like I also think we shouldn't actually give all the responsibility to individuals. So we again need some kind of a mixture, right? Like we need carbon prices, etc. But we also might need policy sequencing. We might need polycentric governance, etc., and move more towards such a sustainable transition perspective. And now I took a lot of time. Sorry, back to you.
No, thank you. Actually, that was very comprehensive and good. We are almost coming to the end. Actually, I think somebody else had more like a comment on, something that Asadi were bringing, donut economics, Kate's thing. Maybe I should. Is there any other question? A lot of future economic growth would be coming from digital economy, and in many ways it would be decoupled from natural resources. However, there's a caveat. Okay, I think people are making some comments actually rather than actually asking a question here. So I think it's a good time to actually close this session. Jeng, well, that's a provocative guy. Let me bring him in actually just for a minute. Yes, Jeng, go ahead.
Thank you, Sweta. I just want to make a quick question. I think they are basically, we recognize that the logic is that they are planetary boundaries. And with the current technology, the planetary boundaries is just not enough to give space for all the human beings on the Earth to have a basically decent material life. And there are two ways out. So first is that the technology-enabled decoupling may help us to continue to grow and provide material lives to the growth to the people without going beyond the planetary boundaries. The other is to recognize that probably technological progress is not advancing enough, that we will have to slow down and sacrifice some of the growth or the speed of growth just so that we don't break the boundaries. So I think the technology-enabled decoupling is a good idea because that provides the humanity all the possibilities without confining ourselves to a fixed space that for our development. However, the speed of the technological progress may not be consistent with the need for us to take climate actions and for the development we need for to give everybody a decent life in the coming decades. So if you take into account the Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa, they are 45 billion people, which may need industrialization and urbanization in the coming decades to have the basic life supplies. And that would mean huge amount of production, steels, concrete, buildings, roads, infrastructure, and everything. So, and the technology coming to replace the current technology of doing this, like steel making and making concrete or building infrastructure, may take also decades to mature and being applied worldwide. And at the same time, we only have a few decades for us to take climate actions to drastically reduce our emission. So I just don't see how these numbers and timelines would add up. So it seems that we are we don't have, of course, we don't have a clear answer to these hard questions, but we should not just circling around this question because we don't have the answer at the moment. So I just want to take the views from the expert, how is there any way we can address this? Should we talk about this, or should we just be pragmatic and try to have bits and pieces here and there where we can actually achieve? Thank you.
And then Asad, you want to take it up quickly, actually? Say something more?
No, I think the message is quite clear. And I don't have much to add actually. And also that the time constraint is there that I have to leave in 2 minutes. So I want to listen to Hamza's concluding remarks.
Actually, yeah, that's true. And Jan?
Maybe if I may just a second, I do think that, I mean, these there are various steps in this transitions, and we do not need to have everything ready by tomorrow or even not by 2030. I think we need to start clearly with decarbonizing the power sector. I think the technologies are there, and this will be a large chunk. When it then comes to the kind of dematerialization, I agree there are more difficulties, but also I would like to highlight there is kind of like the speed and the power of technological change can be so much faster. I mean, if you think of this little thing here, right? 10 years ago, we all, like, this is my smartphone, like nobody basically, like, this was inconceivable that we have internet ready everywhere at any point in time. This is just 10 years ago. So I'm a little bit more optimistic that, like, once we actually set those incentives right, then we also get the changes quite quickly.
Thanks, Jan. Okay, let's actually close it. Thank you so much, Asad, Jan, and Rudy, actually, for great presentations and a lovely discussion, actually, although on a topic probably you didn't think it would actually take the turn to. As we close the two-day workshop, I'd like to invite now Sandra Spies. She's the head of section Environmental Policy, Biodiversity and Forests at GIZ. So welcome, Sandra. So for your closing remarks.
Thank you very much. I'm really very enthusiastic about this discussion we just heard. I'm really inspired what I heard, and now I'm trying to wrap it up in the most possible way, because there's really many issues we've been touched on. Fiscal policy is and will be receiving more attention as a result of the current crisis. Globally, governments were and continue spending unprecedented amounts on rescue and recovery measures. That's pretty clear. And at the same time, reduced economic activity as a result of lockdowns and other restrictions is causing tax revenue to fall. Coming out of the health and economic crisis, society will face difficult discussions on how to adjust taxing and spending to this post-crisis situation. And we heard in these three presentations and also in the discussion how this is really happening, and we saw a couple of examples also. Looking at the challenge of climate change, nature loss, we also talked about the overuse of resources and pollution that we are facing. It is important that reforms of fiscal policy are undertaken with these next looming crises in mind. And more than that, the taxing and spending are increasingly used by governments as levers for decarbonization and to drive the transition to green economies. This has been the basic premise of discussion in this workshop yesterday and today. This also makes ministries of finance become more important actors in climate and environmental policy. And I feel that this is really growing. I worked in Costa Rica for the past years, and the Ministry of Finance has never been that involved as it has been during the past years. And it is reassuring that in many countries, finance ministries are proactively assuming this role. At the creation and growing membership of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action is showing. And it was a pleasure to hear Mr. Dudi Ruliadi from the Indonesian Ministry of Finance, whose minister is a co-chair of the coalition, speak about this initiative earlier this session. Green fiscal reform, like all fiscal reform, can be politically challenging, and we're really talking about a challenge here. As the discussion in this last panel session has shown, green fiscal policies like carbon tax or the reform of harmful subsidies create winners and losers. In Germany, we have our own history of experience with green fiscal policies, including an environmental tax reform in the early 2000s. A renewable energy surcharge that was mounting significantly in the early 2010s and led to increasing electricity prices, and now the introduction of a carbon price on transport and heating fuels at the beginning of this year. And none of them was politically easy, not at all. So the politics are further complicated by the fact that the costs, like rising fuel costs, are usually more visible and felt more directly than the benefits, like improved environmental quality or more available resources for health or for infrastructure. Can be very abstract. And as a result, public opposition to green fiscal reform is often more outspoken than public support, because it's not that directly felt. This is also true in a rich country with considerable public support for environmental policy like Germany. This creates a need for political leadership, careful policy design, as well as good communication, and also a certain consequence, because walk the talk, that's something we mentioned in this session, is also an important aspect. No, it cannot stay at the theoretical or the conceptual level. Jan, in this last session, has shared some ideas on how carefully design policies and how this can help overcome these political challenges when it is based on good data and analysis, and also embedded into larger political concepts, not like social packages that already exist, rather than designing something new. In this context, it was also a pleasure to hear Mr. Saad Naqvi to speak about political economy challenges of fiscal reform in the context of a greener recovery in the closing sessions. Within PAGE, the 5 mentioned UN institutions work together to help policymakers develop the policy framework for inclusive green economies and green recovery. Such inclusive approaches are a strategy to improve political buy-in, as well as policy design and effective implementation. You're supporting 20 countries, as you mentioned, and I liked your question, today or tomorrow, no? What are we really talking about? GIZ is supporting the transition to inclusive green economies at global, regional, and country level. In the Asia-Pacific region, GIZ works with several governments to build capacities for the inclusive green economy, including for green fiscal policy reform. And at a global level, GIZ is a long-standing partner not only of PAGE and the Green Fiscal Policy Network, but also other networks and initiatives like the GGKP and the NDC partnership, which promote global policy learning and peer exchange in this area. And also an important point I heard, to go beyond pure government approaches. I hope that this workshop has been an effective contribution to such policy learning on green fiscal policy and green recovery. And on behalf of the Green Fiscal Policy Network, I would like to thank ESCAP for partnering for this event and for bringing its knowledge of the region, its convening power, and its good relations with governments in the region to this table. All presenters from countries, international organizations, and think tanks for their valuable contributions, all participants for their active participation throughout these 2 days, and finally also the team at UNEP, ESCAP, and GIZ who helped to organize this event. I leave this session in a very inspired way and got really plenty of insightful moments, and I would like to hand over to Hamsali Malik. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for comprehensively covering last 2 days of workshop, as I won't have to go through the details of each item. It's been after a while I was able to set aside dedicated time and learn by engaging, and I would say in a consistent manner, an hour-and-a-half session, taking notes, checking the web pages. So it's been a learning experience for me personally. I hope other workshop participants have the same experience. There was a lot of debate, especially in the last section, of the right reasons, including on decoupling and whatnot, and degrowth and so on and so forth, right? So let me try and tease out 3 or 4 broader, uncontroversial points, which I hope people can agree on as a final thought. And these are a little broader points, which I think are important if you want to take the works of this network in particular and the kind of issues that were highlighted in this workshop specifically. One, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the role of state or fiscal policy is central. Now, it seems like an obvious statement to many people, but if you zoom out a little bit, 2 decades ago, 2.5 decades ago, at least when I was a grad student, it was not like that at all. Actually, it's the other way around. Fiscal austerity was a thing, market liberalization, fiscal policy was perceived as evil, inefficient, not being very helpful for the economy. Monetary policy was given a lot of role and so on and so forth, right? 2008 crisis was a reality check, but fundamental things did not change. So it needs to be restated, I think, now, especially in the context of COVID pandemic. The role of the state is fundamental, and by corollary, role of fiscal policy is fundamental in inducing any recovery in response to a shock like this, and more importantly, in pursuing international goals like SDGs and climate action. So that's, of course, I think is a fairly non-controversial conclusion, if I can call it that. Number 2, policy measures, whenever we look at in the context of COVID-19, and it was presented yesterday in session 1 as well, looking in the details of fiscal measures, separating the initial responses versus recovery measures and so on and so forth, that has not been very optimistic. That has not been very a positive picture. Does not paint a positive picture. A lot of measures are still not consistent, are still not green enough, are still not in line with the ambitions of the 2030 agenda, are not promoting climate action as a lot of people hoped last year, that this is an unprecedented crisis offering unprecedented opportunities. So we will be going in that direction. However, a year and a half later, we are now sort of saying it has not happened, which means more needs to happen. Conversation needs to continue. The pressure needs to remain on. This kind of dialogue needs to be there. The engagement with member states or policymakers has to be stepped up. The job is not done. In fact, if anything, it is just the beginning. In this context, in this workshop, we discussed, of course, a range of green fiscal policies. We talked about the overall role which they can play. In session 1 yesterday, we talked about sustainable public financing, especially the green bonds, potential green bonds and green budgeting. We also touched upon fiscal policy or state in general serving as the role of an enabler to attract private investments, which I agree with Asad, has to play a fundamental role under the guidance and leadership of the state, I might add. But yes, they have to be engaged. Because on their own, they're not going to do it. On their own, they're out there to make money. They're not there to support SDGs. That's the role of the governments. I'm quite clear on this particular point. Then we also talked about the potential of carbon pricing, which is becoming a removal of fossil fuel subsidies, which is gaining a lot of traction, I would say, among policymakers. Again, not long ago, around Paris Agreement, in fact, 2015, there was talk of it, but not much action. And now you see data, now you see which countries are taking measures, you take heart from it. You're like, okay, countries are actually now begun to move on that. Again, a lot of potential is there. So that's the kind of thing we stand at. So in a nutshell, to me, it's basically this kind of workshops help set the narrative, change the narrative, changing the growth approach, having some elements of, if you can use the word degrowth or decouple, but trying to understand it better, exactly what it means, how to go about doing that. What exactly is the role of green fiscal policies? What are the political economy constraints that countries face? Asad gave a lot of examples, but very specific examples. It's not enough that the governments go ahead and agree and say, okay, I'm going to do that, because opposition is not going to let them do that also. So you need coalition in the civil society, actually, to make sure the continuation of policies is there, irrespective of the political government. That's why I use the term state, not the government, right? So it really helps you understand now this workshop, the narrative needs to change in which directions. One of my professors always used to say the success of a good workshop, of a good seminar, is that you don't get answers, but you get more questions to think about. And I think, to me, at least, it served the purpose. It was intriguing on many levels. There are areas which I thought I was settled in my head as like fairly clear, but after that, like, not really. I really have to again check my thinking, check the data. Maybe I'm theorizing in certain ways, and I'm not being consistent with how rapidly actually things are evolving. So I have more questions now. I have more thirst now to say, let's investigate these things more on which issues and how and what. In ESCAP, we're doing a lot of work on green bonds, for instance, or debt for climate swaps nowadays, right? In general, a lot of work around greening. But exactly how to do that, and is there any genuine demand of that? Is there any estimate or understanding of what the potential impact is going to be? It's far too early, right? So the conversation, as I said, just begun. The narrative has just begun to change. Let me conclude on two observations on the lighter mode. People talk about narrative changes and paradigm shifts, the words were mentioned. They're very profound words, paradigm shifts and narratives. And in fact, it takes decades, if not centuries, right? So up until the 18th century, for thousands of years, I think human societies were convinced that you need strong monarchies. There is no other way you can have any other system that can be better for the society of humankind. And look where we are, only in 100, 200 years ago. Not long ago, a vast majority of people thought Black people should not have any right to vote. And within a generation, US elected a black president. Narratives change, right? They do. Talk to somebody in 60s and say this is going to happen, make a movie like Back to the Future and show a Black president, nobody will buy it. Not at all. They'll say this is absolutely berserk, so on and so forth. Even if somebody is willing to appreciate, who's not a racist, will not be able to see the change that happens. So the power of narratives is actually quite non-linear. It starts very slowly, but once after a certain threshold, it really picks up pace. This very nice movie, I don't know, nice or not, I liked it. I use that with my son, called Inception. I'm sure you have seen that one. So you plant an idea and you leave it there and you don't elaborate, you don't anything. You come back after many times, then it feels that this was your own idea. So in a way, these workshops are playing the role of putting a role of inception around these ideas among policymakers, among researchers who are writing and thinking about these issues. So my message is, let's not worry about whether it's going to have an impact or not, as long as we know we are moving in the right direction, as long as we know we're nudging in the right direction, as long as we know we are asking the right questions, we're putting in the right evidence, we're putting in the right knowledge base to again, and we're facilitating the conversation on these fronts. I think we should be fine. We may not see a rather big change in our lifetimes, but we'll be at least heartened to see that we played a part in this role. So I would really, really like to thank our partners, in particular, Green Fiscal Policy Network, the founding partners, IMF, GIZ, and UNEP, collaborating with us for this workshop. I hope this is not the first one. We will continue. On that note, actually, I noticed on the webpage of the network that you have associated partners, and I did not see the name of ESCAP. So I'll reach out to you guys to see how that can be corrected, and if we can become a little more consistent partner with this network, so we can continue engaging in similar workshops going forward. Thank you very much once again, all the participants. Thanks, Shweta, for moderating this last session very enthusiastically. I know you're a passionate researcher. Thank you, all the speakers. It was always a treat. Jan, nice to meet you, and treat to listen to you, Asad, once again. Goodbye from Bangkok, from me and my side. Over to you, Shweta.
Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks, Hamza, and thanks, Andra, actually, for the last words. Actually, as I said that, I thought with Hamza actually closing it, basically it comes full circle. He started off this workshop yesterday with the first session moderating it. So we had the first words from him and the last from him too. So good. Thank you all actually for a wonderful discussion. And I think everybody gained in the end. So as Hamza said, maybe actually we have more questions and it might be a good thing, right? So we'll hold more workshops to answer those questions, to find more questions to answer later on. Thank you. So signing off from Bangkok now.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.